Looks like you have quite a stack of books there.
Yeah,
so
it's just preliminary reviews.
I don't know if I'm going to get my reviews done.
No, I'm not going to review really any of them. I'm going to preview all but one, and I'll just re-review the one that I've reviewed already, the Elementary Turkish. But if you get around to the Asian American thing.
Well, that's what I'm going to do first.
Okay, there we go.
So we're going to review these DVDs, the Asian Americans.
Amazing Americans. And many are. It's pretty amazing.
Yes. PBS documentary, and as you know, I like watching PBS documentaries. I find them to be very well done, very informative. And even if they have biases, they give me plenty of information that makes me eager to look things up. And that's what I like. I love learning, and I love looking things up for myself. So I would highly recommend this PBS documentary, Asian Americans.
To look at, not to rubber stamp necessarily.
I highly recommend that everybody watches this Asian Americans.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna start. I have my notes all backwards. Because I watched it multiple times.
Yeah. At least twice. Yeah. Me twice, maybe you 3 times. There we go.
So, I'm going to try to do it in order, though, of how you will watch it, probably. There are 2 discs in this, so the first one starts breaking ground. We're told about people's grandparents who came to America in search of opportunities. One man came from a tribe and was part of a living display in a world fair, so people in all corners of the world could see what tribal life was like. I mean, sort of like a zoo exhibit, like a traveling zoo, or a traveling fair. I guess it's a fair. So I don't know how accurate they were, but whatever. The person interviewed said that it was done to show that white people who were evolutionarily or whatever superior. In actuality, it was believed that Asians were intellectually superior back then, even by white people. So this isn't accurate. Yeah, it was believed. That's what I was taught when I was young. That the belief was that Asians were the most intellectually superior people of the world, and then
I've got it. Yeah, just keep going. People have seen
Europeans and
discovered that hot.
And then African people were way down at the bottom.
I don't know if that was taught back then.
Well, that's what I was taught when I was young. That's what was believed.
That kind of changed over the years. But Hitler thought that Jews were intellectually inferior, and lots of people.
Well, a lot of people. There's a lot of racist people out there who think that whatever race their ancestors belonged to were superior.
Well, I think around up until
whatever.
1945, many different cultures believed that about themselves. The Japanese would have believed that about themselves. Germans, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, English people, not so much Brits.
So I don't know if it was
French
just
people.
My generation we were taught. I don't know, but that's what the grapevine of information. That's what we were hearing, that Asians were most intellectually superior, and that's among white people. They were saying that.
So there's a guy supposed to be a racist called Philippe Rushton. He might still be teaching at the University of Western Ontario, who was saying that there was this much difference between Asians and whites, and then a huge difference down to black.
Okay.
So it's almost tied. Photo finish here, throw a blanket over them, and then black's way down at the bottom. I'm very skeptical of that, but it's based on IQ tests.
I think it has more to do with the culture that you're raised in and what those values are. The values of that culture. If the values of that culture are singing and dancing around, well, you probably have better skills dancing and singing on average, if that's what everybody is valuing.
She's talking about Irish people.
Exactly. So I mean, there's some people who believe more, like they I guess the continental Europe, they really admire athletics and art, for example, in a lot of places.
And sports.
I said
So-
athletics,
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Yeah.
which
I
I
read that.
don't admire athletics, but
No.
anyway, whatever. Okay, where was I? Irish people building railway on the east, Chinese building railroad on the west of America.
I'm part Irish, incidentally. So,
Told a story about a man who came over at age 14 and quickly learned English and cut his queue. He wanted to look and be American. He got a job on a milk route where he met a woman he'd marry. She, as a girl, she'd worked as a servant in a brothel, knew that what her future would be like there, right? And so she ran away and took shelter in a home. She was raised as a white American. So this is the kind of person he was interested in, right? He wanted to be an American. She wanted to be American. And there were a lot of people that, and are still a lot of people who seek citizenship in the United States because they actually legitimately don't want to be, they're escaping a system that they don't want to be a part of, and they do want to be a part of the United States. They want to be American people. So anyway, do you want to talk about the queue, James? Why
It's
this
just
guy cut his
something-
queue?
yeah. Sign of freedom. I mean, it was something that was required of the Chinese by the native Chinese of China, and also places where they colonized. When they were imperialized, not so much colonized by the Manchu coming from the north, the language doesn't seem to be related at all to Chinese, really. Manchu, they're colonized. They were, incidentally, almost any measure of so-called civilization behind the Chinese. We have a weird idea that colonization, imperialization comes with superior technology or civilization, whatever we want to call it. Through the run of history up until 1492, that was not the case. There'd be exceptions, but the rule was basically people of lower civilization conquering people of higher civilization. That's from at least 500 BC. Okay?
Oh, I have a note to look into the exclusion laws, which I haven't yet.
Oh,
White woman is talking about the racial hierarchy. I don't know if she's white. She looked white
it's hard to say, but it's kind of scary now, isn't it?
in America. She said white at the top, black at the bottom. But even in New Orleans, the East Indian man and his African American wife were allowed to be buried in a segregated cemetery for whites.
This was a while back.
Yeah.
This is not recently
No,
in
no,
New
no.
Orleans.
Yeah, watch the video. You'll see.
I think Louisiana has a person of partial color as governor. Bobby Jindal. What is he? I don't know. Maybe he's just a
But, I mean,
descendant of slave owners.
can you tell us a little bit about East Indian culture? And, like, I hadn't realized certain things about the language and about European language compared to can you talk about that a little
In
bit?
fact, that the dominant languages tend to be Indo-European and South Asia.
Yeah.
So Hindi,
And I hadn't known that until I met James. He explained this to me. And I was like, huh. And I had friends that were from India over the years, and they identified as white. They, like one woman, she'd tell me, she said there are people in India as white as you, and I'm thinking, yeah, I'm not that white,
No.
but and I didn't care one way or the other. It doesn't matter to me. It mattered to her.
I knew one guy who was saying, in kind of like a British accent, "I'm British," and I'm going, okay, whatever you want to be, I don't care. He'd maintain that pretty well every time you saw him. So.
Now I found the second part, a question of loyalty. I found this to be the most important thing to watch on this documentary, but anyway, because Buddy Uno, very important to learn about. From the United States, went to Japan after Japan occupied Manchuria. So
that's 1937. This is before Pearl Harbor.
And he found a job with the Japanese Army. Those
Yikes.
interviewed are suggesting that his actions were a response to American racism.
Now, what's the problem with that? That's after 1937. He's supporting the Japanese Army. And up until 1941, late in 1941, we're talking December 7th, 1941, they weren't fighting the Americans. They were fighting Chinese people. Fighting is an understatement. They were massacring them. The story goes, Shanghai and then King, they massacred in the space of, I guess, a few days, 100,000 apiece. Later on, when they took over Singapore, this was after they attacked the Americans, not long after, it said 60,000 to 100,000 people massacred. So, he's going along, hey, I hate the way the Americans have been treating me. I'm alive. But I'm going to go and support the Japanese Army in massacring fellow Asians, Chinese. You see how their little narrative breaks down? No, Buddy was a bad guy, but Pauline will lay it out for you.
So, Buddy's dad got put in an American camp, and family was held at home, like they were allowed to be at home and whatever, but they had to follow a curfew after Pearl Harbor. So even with Buddy over there, obviously on the side of the Japanese,
and making a point of it, like he's a
strong point,
a journalist.
The dad wasn't put into a camp until Pearl Harbor. So
there's something wrong there. Like, yeah, they went into their house and tore up the floorboards. Hey, like, if I'd raised a kid like that, I would have been saying, come on in and just tear the place apart. Please kind of put it back together again. Like, this guy's just a shame.
Because you have to, anybody should be wondering, when you have Buddy Uno as a son, where did this come from?
Wow.
So anyway, loyalty questionnaire, 2 questions asked. This is to people in the camp. Would they be willing to pick up arms against the emperor? And would they, against
Japan,
whatever. Not necessarily the emperor or Japan. It could be anybody that the U.S. is fighting. Would they basically be willing to fight on the side of the U.S., right? And would they renounce the emperor? And the woman interviewed said that her parents answered no to both questions. Yet, they were allowed to stay in America. And this woman now, she's old. She was born in America. Japan invaded the Philippines, American colony at the time. Buddy continues to champion Japanese dominance of Asia. The narrator says that Buddy evolved into an unapologetic propagandist for Japan.
Okay. Can I talk about that?
Yeah?
Okay. Evolved. It didn't evolve. It didn't devolve. So, I had a conversation a while back with a person I've got to say is a full left. That's the way it goes. And he was saying that Ortega, this dude, exercising the reins of power in Nicaragua, boy, he's changed. And I just said, no, he hasn't. He's the same as he was in the 80s. He was around in the 80s with the Sandinistas. The thing is, that's when I came up with the one way of telling whether you should support someone. It doesn't matter if they're right, left, or whether they claim to be right, left, center, up, down, forward, and backwards. If they're wearing a military monkey suit, I don't care if they're white, person of color, or green from Mars. If they're wearing a military monkey suit, they are not to be supported. They are not to be put up with. That's it if they are leading, not an army, but a either something claiming to want to take over a country or actually ruling a country. He was ruling a country back then. So I can recall some NDPers coming to me. One was a self-declared communist, and saying, hey, can we get some money for, one was a university professor, the other guy, can we get some money for you for the Sandinistas? And I say, who's leading them? And understand, one of those guys was trying to get me to run for the NDP. That's where I swung back then, and up until last year. That's where I swung, and I still swing on what I consider the left wing. The NDP is gone. We'll get farther afield when we're looking at something about, what was that show that we're watching about Jeremy Corbyn and stuff like that? Pull the plug on these kind of parties, the faux left-wing parties. And yeah, it's about anti-Semitism.
We'll get into that
sometime. So I said, how does he dress? Pretty snappily. And I said, yeah, but what sort of, is he wearing a business suit? No, he's wearing army stuff. And I said, I'm not supporting anyone at the very best wearing army uniform as a now styling a military monkey suit. At the very best, all I can remain is agnostic. Back then, I was agnostic. I was going, yeah, I don't like the Americans. I don't like Ortega. Since then, I've come to realize the Americans were right in Nicaragua. They weren't very nice and all that sort of stuff. Ronald Reagan territory and all that sort of stuff. But they were better than Ortega. You got that?
Okay, so Buddy's brother Howard was working for the American military and renounced Buddy. Buddy was obviously not an American in a Japanese uniform, which that's what they said in there. He was an American in Japanese uniform, and it was like, obviously not. He did not want, like, you don't join, work with the Japanese army anyway, when the Japanese army is fighting against America. It doesn't, he was never an American. He was captured by Filipinos and taken as a prisoner of war.
And that's amazing. I don't know. The Filipinos that I've run into have been maybe on average the nicest people around. And this is after the Japanese have wiped out, according to this, the stats from this show. 1.1, we'll round it down to 1 million Filipinos.
Yeah.
Like most, like if it had been Japanese, getting hold of someone who wiped out 1 million Japanese, I don't think Buddy would have survived.
Now,
you know what I'm saying?
In Buddy's defense, I expect that Buddy was under the age of 25 when all this was going on. If he was over the age of 25, well, no sympathy for me. But under the age of 25, your brain is not fully developed yet. So you are not an adult until you are over age 25. So, and you tend to be the most aggressive before the age of 25. So between 15 and 25, and males are more aggressive than females. So the most aggressive people in the world tend to be, like, on average, are going to be between the age of 15 and 25. And they're going to be males.
Guys.
So, maybe after age 25, he was okay. I have no idea. One woman interviewed, she's a Korean American, says, unless you respect your heritage, you'll never find an identity. And
wow, can you imagine can you want to?
Yeah, I do. Like, how many people, like, if let's say some Irish Americans stood up and said that. Would people wonder about that? Honestly, I mean, you have to. I wonder about dual citizenship, and they always say that if in the Olympics or something, when Canada is playing anyone else in the world, nobody's cheering for Canada.
Well, soccer is the classic
or whatever,
example.
right? And
in Toronto, the home team, let's say they're playing the Greek team, the home team is, in terms of the number of fans there, is the Greek team, or the Portuguese team, or whatever.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it really makes me wonder about whether there should be a dual citizenship. Because whenever there's dual citizenship, one really has to wonder about the allegiance of the, I mean, when there's
Are you listening,
some
Andrew
sort of
Scheer?
confrontation, and that could be with anyone. It could be, I mean, you have to wonder about it. If you don't, well, you're really foolish. I mean, when somebody has dual citizenship, then who whatever.
The past
Anyway.
leader of the Conservative Party here in Canada, dual citizenship apparently with the United States.
Okay, so the third part, Good Americans. Toy Young-gun was selected as American Mother of the Year. She owned a Chinese-American laundry. Education was the American dream. If you worked hard and educated yourself, you could succeed in America. And there's actually a lot of proof
In her family.
that does work out, you know, so...
One of her kids went to MIT. Had already gone through, apparently.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe they were announcing it wrongly, but by 1952, a long
Her
time ago.
husband had been in the U.S. Army in World War I. And a woman talked about her father, who had studied classical Japanese poetry in China and worked in a laundry in America, and then wrote for the Chinese daily newspaper. She said her family, I think, they were proud that they kicked the Westerners out and got their land back, the Japanese.
We're being charitable. My interpretation of it initially was the Chinese in America were proud. When she said they were proud, or we were proud, that the Chinese, and happy, and were happy, that Mao Zedong in 1949, I believe it was, kicked the foreigners out of China and took control of their own land. Can you imagine if a white person said that?
So, Chinese Bank was allowing Chinese Americans to send money back to their families in China. They advertised in the China Daily News, and the paper was suspected to be a communist paper. Now, I want to say something about that. We're often shown people in documentaries that are working as maids or whatever or childcare workers or whatever in various countries for wealthy households, and they don't have documentation or whatever, and they're sending money back to their country of origin to support their families or whatever, and it's seen as, oh, well, you know, we should help these people out and whatever. But one, if you hire somebody who doesn't have citizenship, you are both exploiting the system and exploiting the worker if you're paying them less. I mean, why are you hiring illegal immigrants rather than people who went through the process to get legal citizenship? It doesn't even... So, anyway, and people sending money back. I know, I come from the Peace Country, where there's a lot of people who work in the oil industry or elsewhere in centers up there or whatever. They'll come from out east, from eastern Canada. A lot of people come from Newfoundland, and they get the reputation, fairly so, because it happens all the time, of loading like 20 people into a one-room apartment or whatever, and because they're saving up as much money as they can to bring home to Eastern Canada. They don't want to stay in the Peace Country. It's like they actually have some sense. They don't have the gold rush mentality. They're making the money there, but they actually live in their communities in Eastern Canada, and they're going back there. And but at the same time, if the money is made in a country and then shipped out to a different country, then it's going to drain the country where the money's being made. Do you see what I'm saying? So you actually don't believe in the values or anything like that of the country where you're making the money if you're sending the money out.
So
And
the
I
same
know it's a
criticism that
complicated
is applied to
situation.
capitalists can be applied to workers. Workers, I would consider them having the gold rush mentality. They don't care about the environment getting ripped up.
No,
Not just the
they
capitalists,
tend not
it's the
to.
workers.
Exactly.
It's just
Yeah, because they
take the
they-
gold or take the money and run.
Exactly. Yeah. So fake birth certificates claiming birth to American citizens. So, well, you can look into that. Paper migration of people suspected as spies. They bought fraudulent citizenship papers, so they were illegal immigrants in the United States. The woman's, the poet father that I was talking about earlier, was one of these illegal immigrants who ended up working for the China Daily News. The American government gave these illegal immigrants the option of admitting under the Chinese confessions program to having bought fraudulent papers, so they could then acquire legal citizenship.
Now,
They were
what
given
the
the
hay is
option
wrong
to
with
have
it?
legal citizenship.
But there were all sorts of people crying about that, and there was no mention. I'm not sure exactly, but the government did it. But I think it was so. This is after Mao took over in China, and it would be so the Chinese, the communist Chinese, couldn't come to someone and say, "Hey, like we know you're illegal, and we're going to expose you unless you do some little favor for us, or some big favor, or increasingly big favor."
It makes sense,
and
right?
stuff like that. It was just like, let us know. So yeah. So,
Yeah.
but that apparently is a cause of grievance or something like that. And you're like, oh my
Okay.
God, like blacks, indigenous, African Americans have some causes for grievance, but for Pete's sake, do not make your thesis based on such trivial little things. I mean, it was actually helping the Chinese out. Jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway, Asians became the dominant ethnicity in Hawaii. Thanks to American democracy, these Asian Americans had a political voice as citizens of America and Hawaii.
They'd be some of the first to actually elect their own representatives of all Asians anywhere. But somehow or another, it's a cause for grievance. They had to fight for it. Understand, the only people I have sympathy for in Hawaii are the native Hawaiians, who are in the vast minority. It's not Japanese and Portuguese and Chinese immigrants. What do I call that? When whites do it over here, it's settler culture.
65 immigrants